Hello, I'm Nate, aka B-Tier Mutineer. I make guides and discussion videos about games I like, particularly RPGs. Today, I want to do a deep dive analysis on Lothering, the starter town of Dragon Age Origins. Seda Neen in Morrowind, the Imperial City in Oblivion, Riverwood in Skyrim, and other similar settlements exist in RPGs as starter towns, friendly to some extent, and civilized to some extent areas where the player can learn the basics of the game. Sometimes the player is thrust into these towns immediately after character creation, as is the case with Morrowind. Other times they go through an initial combat-heavy sequence or dungeon to learn how to fight and loot before they are finally thrown out into the wild, but heavily incentivized to travel to the starter town, as is the case with Oblivion and Skyrim. In contrast to this, Lothering is a small village that the player character and their starting companions visit after the extended prologue of the game is completed, this usually being multiple hours after the player began their playthrough. Lothering does indeed act in similar ways to how a lot of starting towns in other RPGs do, as we'll discuss later when exploring all the town has to offer. But unlike with these other starting settlements, the player already knows how to engage with pretty much all of the game systems. So Lothering doesn't really have a reason to exist, or does it? Dragon Age Origins is unique due to its titular origin stories, which take the player through a unique introduction into the game's world and story by giving them a specific perspective through which to look at the world based on their character's background. Essentially, the player gets tutorialized during their chosen origin story. Furthermore, at the end of each origin, the player character is taken by Duncan, the mentor figure, to the ruins of Ostagar, where the king's army is preparing to face the Darkspawn, the main enemy in the game threatening the land. At Ostagar, the player is put through a still quite linear adventure, teaching them how to play the game, especially in terms of combat with added difficulty, but also offering a few other features such as a merchant and side quests for extra rewards and role-playing opportunities. So by the time the player completes this extended prologue at Ostagar, they should have a good handle on how to play the game. They have already had the experience of controlling a full party of 4 characters, even with different character builds, getting Davith and Jory in the initial Korcari Wild section, and a soldier or a mage and a soldier when fighting through the Tower of Ishal. Plus, of course, Alistair, who is the first main companion you get from Ostagar and who stays with you throughout the game. So if the player already understands how to play the game, why does Lothering exist? And I don't just mean why it exists physically as a location you can visit. Why is Lothering an obligatory location you must visit before you can embark on the actually important main quests? Why is it designed like a starter town in any other RPG, with super simple quests, a few merchants, some role-playing opportunities in dialogue, and a couple of recruitable companions? You don't have a choice whether or not you want to travel to Lothering. When you are given control of your character outside of Flemeth's hut after you've learned of the monumental tasks you have before you, to raise an army against the Darkspawn and deal with the treachery of the man who let the king, many soldiers, and all your fellow Grey Wardens die, you travel to the area transition and the world map opens. But instead of having access to all of those locations you will have to travel to, the only option you have available is Lothering. Why? Even if you sprint through the entire village without interacting with anyone, you will still be treated to a scripted combat encounter against a group of Darkspawn attacking Bodan, the dwarven merchant, and his adopted son Sandal. And after saving Bodan, he will join your party camp so that the player has access to a merchant with special items in their camp, as well as to Sandal's weapon enchanting services. Of course, if you're sprinting through town and ignoring everyone, you'll be missing out on a lot of side content. Enemies to defeat, XP and money and gear, and more importantly, you'll miss out on 2 recruitable companions, Liliana and Sten. Weirdly enough, the other recruitable companions you come across in the game are part of main quests related to a faction, Wynn and Ogren, or connected to completing main quests, as is the case with Zevran, who ambushes you after you complete one main quest. Shale is a special case due to being a DLC companion, so she doesn't count, but if she had been part of the base game, the designers were planning on making Shale's recruitment quest be part of Redcliffe Village, one of the main quest locations. So why are both Liliana and Sten in Lothering specifically? In terms of party composition, after Ostagar you have your own character, plus Alistair and Morgan. You may also have the Mabari Hound as the final 4th party member, You have him automatically if your character is a human noble, but otherwise you have to cure the sick dog at Ostagar and then accept him into your party during the scripted encounter you have when traveling towards Lothering the first time. So at minimum you have 3 characters in your party, and at the maximum you have 4 characters. Technically a full party, but unfortunately the dog can't really act as a full companion well, especially at later levels. The player needs at least 1 more companion to have a party of full combatants. You also, very probably, do not have a rogue in your party, unless your warden is a rogue. Alistair is a warrior, Morgan is a mage, and the dog is kind of a warrior, but mostly just a dog. And you are very much in need of a rogue because they can open locked doors and chests, disarm traps with more ease, and possibly employ stealth for various uses. Rogues are also excellent damage dealers, whether you're using them as archers or dual wielders, and seeing as Zevron's recruitment is tied to the player completing 1 main quest, you need to try and ensure the player has access to a rogue companion from the beginning of the game. So Liliana being in Lothering makes sense. What makes slightly less sense is that you can just completely ignore the tavern where you meet her and thus not recruit her, and not be aware of her existence altogether. In Sten's case, I'm not entirely sure why he's in Lothering. After Shale became a DLC companion, Sten could have been moved perhaps to Redcliffe, where he would have an additional reason to be let out of the cage and recruited so he can help defend the village against the constant undead attacks. In Lothering, I feel that there isn't as much of a reason for the warden to recruit him, but I imagine that they very likely designed Lothering and Sten's recruitment before they removed Shale from Redcliffe, so Lothering ended up being a decent place for Sten, seeing as in a larger city such as Denrim, he would have simply been executed for his crimes. The player isn't just in need of companions, of course. You're very likely at or super close to full inventory after you fought your way through the Tower of Ishal and looted everything there. With no access to a merchant since the quartermaster in the Ostagar camp, you need a place to dump your unwanted loot. You also very likely don't have very good gear, ignoring the DLC items, and not a lot of useful gear to equip your new companions with. So Lothering has not just 1, but 2 merchants to sell to and buy from, as well as some side quests that offer some pretty decent items. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's explore everything that Lothering has to offer, from the moment you enter it until the moment you have interacted with absolutely everything, leaving no stone unturned. First, a bit of context about Lothering. It's a small village in central Ferelden, part of the South Reach region. During the events of Dragon Age Origins, during the 5th Blight in 930 Dragon, following the defeat of the king at Ostagar, after Loghain betrayed him and ordered his troops to retreat instead of reinforcing the king, Lothering received a large number of refugees fleeing the monstrous Darkspawn, flooding in from the south. The villagers of Lothering themselves were also preparing to evacuate the village since they were abandoned by their Arl, lord of the region, Leonas Bryland, and they wouldn't be able to survive a Darkspawn attack. The town's elder, Templars, and Chantry clerics were at this time trying to maintain order and help as many as they could while preparing for the evacuation, while other more unsavory characters, such as an unscrupulous merchant and various groups of bandits, took advantage of the chaos and fear to make a profit. Lothering is, on the whole, an unimportant place, which is abandoned by the people as they flee the Darkspawn, and the only reason it has any importance is the fact that the warden, the player character, is forced to go through it in order to leave southern Ferelden and begin their quest of raising an army by getting aid from various factions. After any one of the available main quests is completed by the player, Lothering will be overrun by the Darkspawn horde, destroyed, and inaccessible to the warden for the remainder of the game. Later on in Dragon Age 2, you can also find out through a letter sent by the village elder Miriam in the year 934 that despite the village council's attempts to rebuild the village, their efforts were in vain due to the Darkspawn blight poisoning the land. It would take decades for the land to recover, and that even then, it may never fully do so. A tragic end for what was quite a vibrant little village, even amidst the chaos of the blight. As you enter Lothering, you are placed in a scripted encounter that involves a group of highwaymen who are demanding money in exchange for letting people pass from the Imperial Highway and into the village of Lothering. There are many different ways for you to solve this encounter. You can simply give the bandits the money, you can intimidate them into letting you pass by telling them you're a Grey Warden, persuade them that there's a poorly guarded caravan coming this way, which causes them to leave to prepare to ambush the non-existent caravan, or of course, you can fight them. Even if you fight them, the moment the leader reaches low health, he surrenders and asks to be spared. You can demand all of their ill-gotten goods, and you can decide whether to kill them or let them go, but either way, they will not be coming back. If you simply get the bandits to let you pass through intimidation or paying them, if you try to loot the crates behind them, they will attack you without warning, which, fair enough. Clearly, those crates belong to them, and you're the one who started going through their stuff. You still have the option to spare them when you defeat their leader, though, which I think is nice. Another interesting piece of information you can learn from the bandits is that Logain, the one who betrayed you and the king and left you to die to Darkspawn, has declared that you, the Grey Wardens, are responsible for the king's death, and set a bounty upon your heads. The bandits may even think to attack you if you can't intimidate them properly when you ask them, rhetorically, if they would really want to fight a Grey Warden. I do think that if you learn this detail here, your journey through Lothering may be a little different if you're a more cautious player, or if you're role-playing your warden as cautious or conflict avoidant. I'll come back to this later. Anyway, right next to the bandits is the corpse of a knight that is lootable. On his person, you can find a locket and a note. The note mentions that he is from the village of Redcliffe and has been sent to search for the legendary sacred ashes of the prophet Andraste, which are said to cure any illness. This is because his lord, Arl Eamon, has fallen ill with a mysterious sickness that cannot be cured through medicine or magic. So his wife has gotten desperate and sent out all his knights in search of these magical ashes. The dead knight wrote in his notes that he believes the Chantry scholar Genetivi is the key to finding the ashes, and that he hopes to meet up with his fellow knight Donal to tell him what he's found out. Unfortunately, he's dead, so the player now has a reason to go into Lothering and search for this Donal individual, if they've read the codex entry, or at least a journal entry. After you deal with the bandits, walk just a little further to the steps leading down into the village, and you're treated to yet another scripted encounter. This time, a conversation with Alistair and Morrigan about your next steps in relation to the main quest. Alistair can provide you with directions to all the important places: Denerim, Ferelden's capital, the Circle Tower, where you can find the mages and the Templars, the Brazilian Forest, where the Dalish elves are rumored to have set up camp, the Frostback Mountain Pass leading to the underground city of Orzammar, where the dwarves live, and Redcliffe Village, where Arl Eamon can be found, an important noble whom Alistair trusts to help you deal with the treacherous Logain. Alistair suggests Redcliffe as a first place to visit, since it's relatively close by and it's also where he grew up, so he at least knows people there, including the Arl. Morrigan says that if it were up to her, she would go straight to Denerim and assassinate Logain, which I wish was an actual option, since Morrigan is a shapeshifter, and so she could simply shapeshift into a cat or other critter, sneak into the estate undetected, shapeshift back into her regular form to assassinate Logain in his sleep, and then sneak back out as an animal or a critter. Problem solved. Or, well, you could also assassinate him if your warden is a rogue, or you have another rogue in your party who is good at stealth. But I digress. After you discuss your options for next steps with Morrigan and Alistair, you are finally set free upon the village of Lothering. The village outskirts near the Imperial Highway bit with the bandits is a sad sight. Poor refugees huddled together who have been running from the Darkspawn with barely any belongings. Crates, mostly broken, strewn about haphazardly, and a general sense of chaos and poverty. You can speak to a fairly moody farmer who seems to have something negative to say about whatever you talk about. You killed or ran off the bandits. He's upset because who else is going to stop the refugees from coming into the village? Right, got it. Great guy right here, this farmer. There isn't really anything unique you can find out from him that you don't also hear from other people around town. Logain came through the village with his soldiers and marched to Denerim, branded the Grey Warden's traitors. There it is, that detail again. Lothering's lord, Arl Bryland, also took his soldiers with him and left to fight in the war, so the people are mostly defenseless other than the few Templars from Lothering's Chantry, trying to keep the peace and protect the villagers to the best of their ability as they prepare to evacuate. After this initial poverty-stricken area, going through the ramshackle wooden gate, you meet a well-meaning Templar who tells you that if you're seeking shelter, there's none to be had, and that you'd better quickly do whatever business you have in the village before moving on. The Darkspawn are coming, so we keep hearing. Lothering is lost. Take what you can and go as far away as possible from the encroaching Darkspawn horde. A bit ahead and to the left of the Templar is a family of elves who were robbed by the bandits. They ask you whether you have anything to spare, explaining the highwaymen took everything from them, including their daughter's pet lamb, which I imagine is actually a stuffed toy, not an actual lamb. You can either give them some money or tell them you have nothing to give them in more or less polite ways, with the final option being to tell them that you killed or drove off the bandits if you did so. If you dealt with the bandits, the elves will be grateful. They'll go see if they can recover at least some of their belongings, but are nonetheless happy that other people won't be preyed upon in the same way. At the beautiful stone bridge is a young red-haired boy yelling for his mother. Speaking to him nicely reveals that his mother left him in the village as she went back to their home, perhaps to pick up some supplies, but never returned. You can offer to help him look for his mother, but he'll refuse, citing that she instructed him to not go with anyone and simply wait for her. You can be rude, or else give him a little coin to get something to eat, or at least direct him to the Chantry where someone will take care of him. If you give him coin, he will always be extremely happy and say something nice about your character. If you're a human, he'll say you're a nice person, like his father or mother. If you're an elf or dwarf, he'll ask you if you are really an elf or dwarf because his father said dwarves are greedy or elves are something. I don't remember exactly. Not really as nice as his son thinks, this man. But I think it's a very neat little detail that you get to experience if you play as a non-human and show kindness to the boy. And I think more importantly, it shows that the boy's perception of this other race changes when he directly interacts with someone who is nice and who directly challenges the things that he was previously taught. Anyway, next to the bridge is a Chantry priest with a big quest board next to him. Morgan or Alistair will likely chime in to tell you that this is the Chanter's board, where people put up various tasks that they need assistance with. The completion of these tasks is often rewarded with coin or other items, which provides an incentive for the player to look into completing these side quests. And especially early on, the player doesn't really have much gear or money, so the Chanter's board rewards are pretty significant. You can also speak directly to the priest, Chanter Devons, and find out that he is a chanter, which means that he has taken vows to only speak words from the Chant of Light, the most important religious text from the Andrastian religion, kind of like a Bible. There can be a funny interaction where your character tells him a chanter says what, and you actually get him to say what, but then he quickly corrects himself by continuing with an appropriate line from the chant. A very nice bit of world building if the player chooses to talk to the priest first before inspecting the quest board. Still in this area of town is a merchant arguing with a Chantry priest. If you walk close enough to them, you'll be pulled into a scripted encounter where you find out that the merchant is charging too much money for his goods, and the Chantry sister is trying to get him to lower his prices or even give away his items to the people in need. The merchant sees you and asks you to intervene on his behalf for a bit of profit. You can accept his offer and tell the Chantry sister to leave, or you can side with her and try to convince the man to lower his prices. There are ways to essentially fail this encounter, leading to the merchant taking his goods and leaving, and no one being happy about the result. You lose out on the merchant, and the village loses out on potentially life-saving supplies they could have spent their money on, even if this guy was overcharging them. If you side with the merchant, he gives you a good amount of money, at least for the early game, and you can also ask for a discount. The discount isn't properly implemented in the base game, but I have Quinn's Fixback mod, which I've mentioned in a lot of my videos, that implements this, as well as many other fixes in quests, dialogues, and scripts. I can't say the unscrupulous merchant, as he is dubbed on the wiki, has very much of value in his inventory. He has a lot of basic weapons and armor that you're better off not spending money on if you know better, but which I certainly went ahead and bought in my first playthroughs of DAO when I thought that any tiny upgrade of armor or damage was worth spending my precious little coins on. He does have a few grenade and poison recipes if that's something you're interested in, and also has a bottle of wine as a gift item, which can be useful for you later on to give to one of your companions. But rather interestingly, he has a unique item which you can steal from him, an Imperium crossbow. Now, crossbows in Origins are quite honestly bad since their damage doesn't really scale with your attributes, but they can be decent in the early game. And more importantly, this particular crossbow is tier 7, the highest tier, having great base stats for a crossbow, but also high strength requirements, because crossbows for some reason require you to be strong, but not bows. Anyway, I think it's a cute little thing to be able to steal a unique item from an NPC, so it's nice that Lothering includes such a unique stealing target to perhaps stoke the player's curiosity and greed, and make them be more likely to attempt to steal from various NPCs, especially more notable NPCs, to see whether they also have a unique item to offer. Before we move on from the merchant, if you're wondering why he's a dwarf in my game, and very likely a human in your version of the game, or other gameplay footage you've seen online, I have a mod that changes him to be a dwarf because his official game file indicates that he was originally planned to be a dwarf. Not really sure why they ended up making him a human in the game, maybe they forgot. I have a lot of these little things that change tiny aspects of the game to make them more lore appropriate or in line with the initial design intent. Overall, it doesn't really do anything for Lothering, although you do get to see and interact with a dwarf in town, which you didn't have other than Bodan at the very exit of Lothering. Maybe they actually changed the unscrupulous merchant into a human because Bodan is already a dwarven merchant, so they didn't want for there to be two dwarven merchants in the same village. Anyway, as you turn back around towards the tall, dominating, and yet somewhat warm presence of the Chantry, your ears are assaulted by a doomsayer, screaming about how the Darkspawn will destroy everything and kill everyone, there's no hope, blah blah blah. Frankly, this is the NPC I find most annoying in the entire game, with Jowan being a close second. His lines are super dramatic and overacted to the point where what he's saying can't be taken seriously, even when he admits that he lost his wife and other people from his tribe to the Darkspawn. This man is Chastened, aka part of the barbarian or nomadic people still living in the old tribal ways in the wilder areas of Ferelden. You can eventually yell at him enough for him to go away, or persuade him more gently that he's not honoring the memory of his wife with all this screaming and doomsaying. After he leaves, the people who are gathered around him talk amongst themselves and wonder if he was right. You can convince them that there is hope yet, and if you're successful, they will decide that their next step is to evacuate and travel north to Denerim, the capital. You can also be more rude, of course, plenty of role-playing opportunities in all of these conversations. Outside of the Chantry is another friendly yet kind of useless Templar named Sir Marin, who just tells you the same kinds of things you've likely been hearing from people. There's no place to sleep in the Chantry, as they're already providing as much shelter during the night for people as they can, though you can still go inside if you want to get a blessing from the priests or pray. If you tell him about the bandits you killed or ran off, he'll mention that you'll find the leader of the Lothering Templars, Sir Bryant, inside, and that he'll be very happy to hear that the bandits are gone. Indeed, the player is definitely nudged at least a little bit at this point to go check out the Chantry, even if for no other reason that it's a new explorable area, and that this Sir Bryant may reward them for dealing with the bandits. Or perhaps you want to report the bandits to the Templars so that the Templars chase them off instead, in which case Sir Bryant is also the one to talk to. As you enter the Chantry, the atmosphere changes to one of warmth, and the music accompanying the Lothering Chantry definitely feels very religious, kind of mysterious, and frankly just cool. Love this track. Inside the Chantry, there are only a handful of people you can interact with. Otherwise, there are just various refugees and villagers, priests, and a few Templars guarding the place. The first interactable NPC you come across is Sir Bryant himself, the leader of the Templars in Lothering, who is trying to ensure the safety of the people, as the Templars are the only defense the village really has against any kind of danger. You can introduce yourself as a Grey Warden to him, to which he very kindly lets you know that you have been branded a traitor if you didn't already know. However, he isn't so quick to believe that the Grey Wardens would be so evil or careless to get the king killed, so he's still willing to converse with you. If you tell him you dealt with the bandits, he'll thank you and offer you a small reward, and also mention that the Chanter's Board has some tasks that need doing for those with the ability to do so. He doesn't have much else interesting to say, but you can ask him if he could lend you some assistance. And despite not wanting to help you openly, he gives you a key that opens a cabinet in the back of the Chantry, from which you can take some supplies, since there are apparently too many things for the Templars to be able to carry them all when they evacuate. In the cabinet, you'll find 4 health poultices, a random generic item, and most mysteriously, a unique pair of ancient elven boots. If you didn't get these boots on PC, it's because they for some reason weren't implemented properly in the PC version, whereas they were placed in this cabinet on the console versions of the game, and thus various mods exist which restore this pair of boots, including the daddy of all bug fix mods, Quinn's Fixpack. Near the Chantry cabinet is a man, Pater Gritch, who is not interactable with unless you pick up a Blackstone Irregulars quest from the Tavern, but nonetheless he is important, because if you don't interact with him, you won't be able to complete that quest, and thus also be barred from doing the final Blackstone Irregulars quest, which requires all the previous quests of the faction to be completed. Near Pater Gritch and the doors leading to the Revered Mother's chambers is a man wearing heavy armor. This is Sir Donal, one of the Redcliffe Knights who is searching for the mythical Urn of Sacred Ashes in order to cure Arl Eamon, an important nobleman who can help you expose Logain's treachery to the rest of Ferelden's nobility in order to gain their support and unify the land to end the Darkspawn threat. Alistair recognizes Sir Donal, and he is recognized in turn. Donal is relieved to see Alistair alive and tells you about Arl Eamon's mysterious illness that appeared out of nowhere and has not been cured through any means. Sir Donal himself came to Lothering to study the books and scrolls from the Chantry's library, hoping to find any kind of clues to lead him to the ashes. However, his efforts have been in vain so far, and he believes that continuing to search is a waste of time. You can let him know his fellow knight is dead, as he was waiting to meet up with him before returning to Redcliffe. If you're particularly callous, you could ask Donal for a reward in exchange for having returned the fallen knight's personal effects and informing Donal of his fate. Out of all the greedy dialogue options in the game, this one really does feel awkward. Like, hey, your colleague is dead. Can you give me some money for letting you know? Regardless, the knight is going to further nudge you towards Redcliffe by saying that no matter what the Arl's condition may be, you will be welcomed in the village and at the castle by the Arlessa. Alistair also expresses his desire to travel to Redcliffe to see for yourselves what Eamon's sickness is all about, as he is concerned about this development. If you try to speak to the priests, you'll find one particular brother whose job it is to keep Andraste's brazier lit. He won't have very much to say other than explaining his sacred duty, but nonetheless I think it's a nice world-building touch to learn about an actual religious ritual done as part of the Andrastian faith by its priest. Speaking of priests, however, you do get to interact in some more depth with the revered mother, the religious leader of Lothering's Chantry. She is a generally kind woman, but she does seem to be very intent on following the rules. So if you tell her you're a Grey Warden, she will not be nearly as helpful as Sir Bryant, and simply tell you that the best she can do is refrain from reporting you to the authorities. You can donate to the Chantry if you think your character is the type to do so, although the only reward you get from this is an improvement on future persuasion attempts on the revered mother, which is only relevant for the quest to recruit Sten, if you go about it the legal way. Otherwise, if you have already recruited Leliana by this point, she will also approve of you donating money to the Chantry, though there are far cheaper ways to improve Leliana's relationship with you later on. If you do donate to the Chantry, there is also an option to ask the revered mother to give you her blessing, which I think is a really nice touch if you're role-playing a character who believes in the Maker and follows the Andrastian faith. Finally, there is an interesting little interaction between the Templar and the revered mother's chambers and Morrigan. If you interact with him, he'll speak to Morrigan, telling her that she seems odd, to which she replies that he would not be the first to think so, but to avert his eyes. He nevertheless says that he'll be watching her, because they don't want any trouble here. It seems to me that this particular Templar, at least, can tell that Morrigan is a mage, but the Darkspawn are the more pressing issue, or perhaps he doesn't care so much about apostates, mages living outside of the circles of magi where they are all supposed to live and study under the close scrutiny of the Templars. I think it makes sense to have some Templars who don't really care all that much about apostates in the village, as long as the mage in question isn't making any trouble, because multiple members of the Hawk family, the family of Dragon Age 2's protagonist, were mages who lived for a long time in Lothering without having issues with the local Templars. Back outside, in the area on the other side of the bridge, there's a few more interesting things going on. A villager named Allison heard that with the danger of the Darkspawn getting closer, the eccentric farmer Barlin put traps all over his farmland and is also searching for poison to add it to his traps. Allison doesn't want any poison, but she would like a few traps to secure her farm too. If your warden or someone else in the active party has a trap making skill, you can create 3 simple spring traps and give them to her for a small reward. An interesting thing about Allison is that if you tried and failed to steal from an NPC in town, she will refuse to talk to you, saying you're a troublemaker. There are a few such unimportant NPCs scattered throughout the game who will have something to say if someone in your party was caught stealing in the area, but I kind of wish there were more of them, especially ones who have side quests that you can miss out on if you get caught doing criminal activities. It feels much more immersive to have these reactions from NPCs. Across from Allison is Elder Miriam, who is taking care of the sick and injured arriving in town. Unfortunately, she's run out of healing poultices, so she asks if you know anything about herbs and potions. If anyone in your active party has the herbalism skill, you can reply in the affirmative. either that you yourself do, or that you don't but your friend does. Morrigan, of course, has 2 ranks in the skill, so as long as you have her in the party, you'll always have the option of completing this quest. Whether or not you need to go craft new healing poultices, once you have 3 poultices, you can give them to Miriam and she'll give you a decent reward, being very grateful for the help. Around here and near the tavern, there are a few gossip NPCs who discuss various rumors they've heard. You're likely to hear them discussing the disastrous battle at Ostagar that led to the king's death, and whatever part Loghain or the Grey Wardens may have had in it. You may hear about Loghain installing himself as regent, and the suspicions of some that killing the king was part of his plan, or the fact that after losing so many soldiers at Ostagar, Loghain is running an aggressive conscription campaign, pressing anyone who can hold a sword into service. I'm not going to go through all the things you can hear if you walk past these gossips enough times, because you can hear anything from news about the Darkspawn or the civil war between Loghain and the nobles who refused to bow down to him, to rumors about the strange goings-on at various main quest locations, such as knights from Redcliffe searching for the Urn of Sacred Ashes, or weird happenings at the Circle of Magi, werewolves being sighted, and so on. I actually might try to collect all of these gossip dialogues one day, since I wasn't able to find all of them anywhere. Next to the tavern, called Dane's Refuge, there is an NPC labeled Helpful Refugee. If you speak to him, he'll caution you against entering the tavern because there are some angry soldiers in there who are looking for someone and who have also started drinking and become more aggressive. The refugee assumes they may be deserters of some kind, but he isn't sure. A player who has talked to many other NPCs before now may be able to figure out that these soldiers could be Loghain's people who are searching for any surviving Grey Wardens in order to capture and or kill them. But even if the player doesn't necessarily connect the dots, they may still think twice about entering the tavern. By this point, you've already heard multiple times that there aren't really supplies left or beds to sleep in, so what use is there in entering a mostly depleted tavern? Still, I imagine that a new player, at the very least, would be intrigued rather than scared to hear of the soldiers in the tavern. Maybe they really are deserters who ran away from the battle at Ostagar, or maybe they deserted Loghain's army due to his betrayal. For all we know, they could be potential allies. Entering the tavern quickly disproves this theory, however. You are immediately accosted by a group of Loghain soldiers who have been asking people if they've seen anyone of your, and I assume Alistair's, likeness, as Loghain desperately wants to shut down any surviving Grey Wardens, not wanting them to sow doubt in people's hearts in relation to how the king died at Ostagar, but also likely believing that the Grey Wardens are a threat to Ferelden's independence. You cannot reason with these soldiers. They wholeheartedly believe Loghain pulled them out of a Grey Warden trap and saved their lives. But before you fight them, a friendly woman dressed in Chantry robes approaches and tries to defuse the situation. This is Leliana, the first recruitable rogue companion. Leliana fails to convince the soldiers to stop fighting, but when the soldiers attack you, she joins the fight with a dagger and helps you defeat them. Similarly to the highwaymen at the entrance of Lothering, if you bring down the health of their commander, the soldiers will surrender. They plead for mercy, and the Chantry woman urges you to spare them as they were clearly no match for you. You can choose to kill them or let them go, with no real consequence either way other than perhaps a slightly lower starting disposition for Leliana if you recruit her. After the soldiers are dealt with, Leliana introduces herself and asks to join your party because she wants to aid you in your fight against the Darkspawn, and also because she had a vision that she interprets as the Maker telling her to do something against the Blight. Regardless of whether you believe in her vision, you can choose to accept her into your party or refuse her help. If you refuse, she will appear one last time near the exit to Lothering to ask to join you again. But you can refuse her even then if you so desire, and after that second refusal, she will not be able to be recruited anymore. In the tavern, there is an interesting fellow next to a fancy-looking chest. He is a representative of a mercenary company, the Blackstone Irregulars, who has fallen upon hard times and needs help rebuilding. They regard Grey Wardens with a lot of respect, and if you decide to help them, you will receive letters from their 2 leaders, Tauron and Raelnor, which you can find in these cool-looking chests. Much cooler than the Chanter's board, that's for sure, but the quests tend to be generally less interesting. One of the quests actually involves speaking to Pater Gritch in the Chantry to get him to make good on an earlier promise he made to help or join the company. As I mentioned earlier when I pointed him out in the Chantry, if you don't speak to him before Lothering is destroyed, you won't be able to complete this quest and also be barred from accessing the final quest of the Blackstone Irregulars. Finally, the other important NPC in the tavern is the bald farmer named Barlin. You may have already heard about his eccentric nature and desire for poison if you previously spoke to Allison about traps. Apparently, Barlin isn't just a farmer or a farmland owner, but also a merchant. He's willing to pay handsomely for 3 vials of venom to spike his traps with, but more importantly, he has some very interesting items for sale. I will particularly highlight 2 items I think are very weird for a small merchant local to Lothering to have: the dagger Thorn of the Dead Gods and the magic staff Lightning Rod. The magic staff is obvious in the way it stands out. Why would a random village merchant have a magic staff, and a more complex electricity-infused staff at that? Was this sold to him by a desperate apostate who needed the money to escape the Darkspawn or the Templars? Perhaps it was the Hawk family selling off the late father's old staff to be able to have enough money to travel north to the Free Marches? Either way, it's certainly not something you'd expect Barlin to have for sale. The Thorn of the Dead Gods, however, is even more interesting. Let me read you the codex entry for this dagger, plus its 2 other sister blades. In the moment that it struck, the blade of the Grey Warden who killed Toth, Archdemon of Fire, shattered into 3 pieces. For years, the shards lay forgotten on the battlefield. Steel became etched with the corrupted blood of the dead god. They were eventually discovered by a Navarran woman. She sold them to a blacksmith, not knowing what they truly were, for 10 bits. The smith, however, knew that he had purchased more than scrap metal and fashioned the shards into 3 identical daggers, the Thorns of the Dead Gods. How did a centuries-old blade, crafted out of a Darkspawn blood-infused Grey Warden blade, make it not only to Ferelden, but in the stock of a tiny merchant in Lothering village? This particular piece that Barlin sells is the lowest tier of the bunch, but it still has a powerful history, and possibly unique properties due to the metal being infused with the blood of an archdemon, a corrupted dragon bearing part of the soul of an old god, who leads the monstrous Darkspawn to swarm the surface and destroy and corrupt everything in their path. And yet, this dagger only costs 2 gold, 41 silver, and 80 copper pieces. I really wonder what made the designers place this dagger in Barlin's stock. I would have found it a lot more plausible in the unscrupulous merchant's inventory at least. But I digress again. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that you can also speak to Danal, the owner of the tavern. Unfortunately, he doesn't really have very much to say that you can't hear from other people, as the only information he can provide are rumors about the state of Ferelden. I believe most of these rumors are based on the state of the main quests, and they do change once you've finished main quests. Danal, however, won't be accessible anymore after you finish a main quest, since Lothering will be destroyed. Hoping this guy made it out alright, because the nice little thing about him is that after the whole mess with the soldiers, he lets you know that he won't tell anyone you're a Grey Warden, because his grandfather was a warden himself, so he doesn't believe that wardens are traitors. It is a bit silly to keep asking him for rumors after this, however, because he will eventually spit out a rumor that apparently the Grey Wardens are the ones who summoned the Archdemon and caused the Darkspawn to attack the surface, because they hadn't been needed by people for too long, so they decided to make the Archdemon appear and do their bidding. After what Danal just said about his grandfather being a warden, I have no idea why he would repeat such a nonsense rumor in your face, especially in a way that completely ignores the fact that you yourself are a warden, and that he knows you are one. I guess some little things just slip through the cracks when the devs don't have enough time to polish up these little details and have to focus far more on critical bugs like crashes and so on. Outside, there's really just one area left, the so-called wilderness, sometimes even described as a forest or woods by some Chanter's board quests. It's not really any of those things. I guess there wasn't enough time, or level designers were busy designing actually important main quest areas, because instead of a patch of woods or wilderness, what we get is a small farm field with a scarecrow, a windmill atop a hill, a couple of smaller hills, one of which has a tree standing proudly upon it, and of course the continuation of the ancient Imperial Highway, which is broken in half where it passes through Lothering, so that the player is forced to at least walk through the village before moving on. I always felt like this area outside of town was weird, because why were bandits just randomly standing about in the middle of a farm field or down next to the Imperial Highway, which would have been a far better strategic spot to catch people coming from the north or trying to leave Lothering towards the north on the highway. The wilderness area just feels very barren. It could have at least had a few more trees. Maybe they had issues with the town taking up too much memory and had to save memory costs on this area. I don't know. I can't speculate on why it's as barren as it is. I can just comment on its strange emptiness and lack of polish. But let's ignore the look of it and just look at what's there. Right as you're about to leave the village to venture out into the wilderness, you witness an argument between a farmer and a chastened man who are being watched over by a Templar as they explain their issue. The farmer claims the chastened man stole food from his cart, and also goes farther than that to say things like, "You barbarians are all thieves." Don't really know whether I'm keen to believe the farmer due to his attitude, but the chastened isn't very nice to him either, saying his grassland eyes are inept, and that the chastened would never resort to petty thievery. Seeing this argument is going nowhere, the Templar breaks it up and tells them to disperse, even though the situation hasn't truly been resolved, and the farmer is still complaining about his missing food. Who do you think stole that farmer's food? I'm betting that one of the bandit groups outside of town likely did it by sending someone to sneak in and steal whatever they could. Or else a hungry refugee could have stolen some food too. It's possible the farmer just saw someone taking things from his cart and then blamed it on the chastened simply because of his existing prejudice. It's also possible the chastened man did steal from the farmer, and regardless of his guilt, the Templar is wisely choosing not to make him and his fellow tribespeople angry. The chastened look well armored and well armed. One Templar clearly can't take all of them in a fight, and even the handful of Templars present in Lothering would likely take a strong beating, even if they did win the battle. The chastened were supposed to have their own barbarian look, but that got scrapped during development due to a lack of budget. But imagine them looking likely similar to the Avar tribes you get to meet in Dragon Age Inquisition in the Jaws of Hakon DLC. I think the Avar and the Chastened are supposed to have different aesthetics, but we didn't really get to see both types of tribes in the DA trilogy, so we can only assume. Moving on from this little altercation, you hear someone reciting something in a strange language. That someone is Sten, the Qunari man who is standing in a cage where the Templars have imprisoned him for murdering an entire family of farmers, children included. If you speak to him, he will admit that the allegations are true and that he has accepted his punishment, standing in that cage and waiting for his eventual death, either due to starvation or due to being found and killed by the Darkspawn who will soon reach Lothering. Both Morrigan and Liliana suggest to, at the very least, free him because such a fate is too cruel even for a murderer. Liliana's perspective, not mine. Whereas Alistair doesn't seem to have much of an opinion. I guess he understands the need for more muscle on the team, but doesn't necessarily want to save Sten's life, leaving it up to you. Sten would rather die in battle than in a cage, and would be willing to join your team to help you fight the Darkspawn if you manage to free him. There are two ways to free him. The first, quite simple and obvious, is to pick the lock on the cage. You can do this if your warden is a rogue and has a decent ability to pick locks, or else if Liliana is in the party, she can also unlock the cage without issue. The second, more difficult way, but possibly necessary if you're not playing as a rogue, and you also don't want to recruit Liliana, is to persuade the revered mother in the Chantry to release Sten into your custody. As I mentioned earlier, donating to the Chantry can help you out in this persuasion check. If you have Liliana in your party, she just convinces the revered mother to give you the key herself. I guess you would want to do this if your warden wants to follow the rules instead of break Sten out of the cage, since Liliana could pick the lock without the hassle of going all the way back to the Chantry to get the key. You can also try to intimidate the revered mother into handing over the key, which is very funny because Alistair is extremely offended by the fact that you tried to intimidate a priest and greatly disapproves. Liliana is also disappointed if she's there with you and fairly severely disapproves as well, whereas Morrigan finds it amusing and approves of your actions. The funniest thing is that you can actually fail the intimidation check, and then you also have the absolute embarrassment of not being able to intimidate a frail old lady, on top of the fact that you've just made Alistair and Liliana hate you a little. Anyway, once you open the cage by your preferred method, Sten is released, and you can choose to either recruit Sten or to simply tell him he is free to go, but that you personally don't want his help. I believe that Sten refuses to leave the cage if you are just setting him free, since he wants to atone for his actions. Finally, we actually make it to the wilderness area. You have 3 groups of bandits you need to fight off for the Chanter's Board quest, Bandits, Bandits Everywhere. These bandits are actually fairly difficult to defeat, especially if you have subpar gear on your characters, like you can see in the footage I recorded with a character who was part of the challenge I played through with only gear received from NPCs being allowed. I obviously didn't have this limitation anymore when I recorded this footage, but there wasn't very much that I could purchase from the Unscrupulous Merchant and from Barlin to improve my team's effectiveness. The most useful group of bandits to kill is the one past the hill next to the water, the group containing the bandit leader, who is an elite enemy. When killed, the leader will drop a full set of heavy chainmail armor, a greatsword, and a light helmet called a Kunari thickened cap. I believe the designers added this gear to him for you to be able to equip Sten with the items, since you get a 2-handed weapon, which Sten is skilled at using, heavy armor suited for a warrior, and a helmet with Kunari in the name, just in case you were getting confused and didn't know what to do with all this stuff. Personally, I don't recruit Sten in most of my playthroughs, so the greatsword tends to be useless since it's just a basic one. However, the heavy chainmail set is a tier 3 steel version that you get for free, and a great upgrade to give to either Alistair or a warrior warden. If you do manage to kill all 3 groups of bandits, you'll be rewarded with 3 gold coins by Chanter Devons, and also cause 2 more Chanter's Board quests to appear, one to kill 3 bears that mauled someone's child, and the other to retrieve a keepsake from a red-headed woman who is the mother of a boy who is being taken care of at the Chantry. It's never confirmed, but most players, myself included, believe that this is the mother of the little boy you encounter near the bridge. She was attacked by a pack of wolves, so you'll have to fight a frankly absurd number of wolves to be able to retrieve something from her person and take it to the Chantry so that they can give it to her son to have as a keepsake to remember her by. Killing the 3 bears is not very hard and also not as emotionally impactful as a keepsake quest, so meh. It gives you XP, I guess. When you go kill the bears, you'll also very likely come across a group of giant spiders you can fight nearby. Don't worry, if you're arachnophobic, you won't see any spiders because I have a mod that turns them into funny-looking boulders. Fighting these terrifying beasts is actually quite difficult because they have access to the Overwhelm ability, which completely disables any action from being taken by the affected individual, and an overwhelmed party member is very likely to be knocked unconscious. Unless you really need the XP or the toxin extract to make venom for Barlin, or if you're very powerful due to using DLC items, superior knowledge, and or exploits, it may not be worth fighting these spiders. They don't really fit with how the rest of the area looks, and certainly seem out of place in such an open environment. The bears and the huge amount of wolves were already pushing it a little bit, but giant spiders right outside a village that has clearly been there for a long time seems improbable. If you manage to complete all 3 Chanter's Board quests, killing the bandits, wolves, and bears, you will be awarded with an extra item for your exemplary service to the people of Lothering, a longsword called Oathkeeper. The flavor text of the sword says it's usually given to the most able Templars as a reward for their accomplishments. It's also described as a blessed blade, which leaves me wondering whether it's enchanted with lyrium or some kind of runes. What do you think? Does the Oathkeeper sword count as an enchanted blade? I'm asking because I'm planning on doing a no magic or enchantments challenge. If you're watching this video much later than when I originally posted it, that challenge may already be out. I'd like to say that blessed doesn't necessarily mean enchanted, but the plus 10% to healing effects received bonus makes me think that it has to be magical. Otherwise, what, you just feel proud of yourself for wielding this beautiful Chantry blessed sword and your attitude makes any source of healing more potent on your body? I mean, who knows? Magic is real in Thedas, and it could very well be that even non-mages are able to slightly influence things through a sort of instinctual or emotional-based magic that usually has small enough effects that no one notices it. Or maybe I just really want to be able to use this sword in the challenge. Anyway, with the final quest turned in at the Chanter's Board, you can finally move on from Lothering. You take the path left of the windmill, perhaps because it's slightly faster, or perhaps because you notice there's a chest there on the side that you want to loot. If you told anyone you're a Grey Warden, even if the soldiers at the tavern simply called you out on being one, a group of desperate, barely armed refugees ambushes you. Unfortunately, there isn't any opportunity to speak to them and convince them against attacking you. They don't really care whether you killed the king or not. They just want the huge bounty placed on your heads. These refugees are usually laughably easy to kill, which makes it feel even worse. These men had no armor, just the clothes on their backs and various weapons scavenged or perhaps which they had as family heirlooms. A mace here, a sword there, mostly daggers, and the only talent they seem to know is precise striking, which slows down their attack speed while giving them a little extra chance to hit you. It's a pathetic display born out of desperation, and I do believe this encounter is designed to make the player feel bad. Maybe if they'd taken a different route or moved faster through the village without arousing suspicion, then those poor refugees wouldn't be dead, and that would be true. That's why I do enjoy role-playing my warden's choices a lot whenever I play through the Lothering section, as well as the entire game of course. There's a lot of choices you can make that mostly just affect how the story feels like, without any big consequences remembered by the game. You may lose out on some things if you avoid certain areas or quests, but get to feel the satisfaction of directing your warden's story in the way that you want it to go based on who your warden is. As you walk up the ramp to get back up on the Imperial Highway, a final scripted encounter occurs. The dwarven merchant Bodan and his adopted son Sandal are being attacked by a band of Darkspawn. You fight off the Darkspawn, and afterwards, Bodan is grateful. Even grateful enough that you can persuade him to give you money. 1 gold if you ask, and 2 gold if you're particularly persuasive. There's a lot of such greed incentivizing choices in DAO, where you don't really get a reward unless you ask for one specifically. Very interesting to think about that in relation to how it makes the player feel to have to ask for a reward if they want one. Even if the NPC you're asking doesn't react negatively to your request, you could still kind of feel like a greedy asshole for asking. Or maybe you really enjoy milking all the rewards you can get from every single NPC, no matter how small. Maybe it's part of your warden's character. I might actually make a video talking about all the greedy choices you can make in Origins. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. After Bodan thanks you for your timely rescue, he asks where you're going, hoping to perhaps travel alongside your group. But he's not so keen on traveling with you if you tell him you're a Grey Warden, and also respects your choice to keep the details to yourself, getting the sense that your group is perhaps a bit too dangerous to be around. And yet, once you leave Lothering and make camp, he shows up and stays around as your personal merchant, and his son Sandal acts as your personal enchanter of weapons. As much as I love Sandal, I can't help but feel Bodan and Sandal's presence in your camp is just a bit too forced. Would have been very happy to meet them as a random encounter on the map whenever you travel, just like you can meet Old Tegrin, another dwarven merchant in the same way. Would have also liked to have other enchanters to add runes to your weapons other than Sandal. Perhaps someone in the Circle Tower once you've saved it, one of the Tranquil, or the Tranquil proprietor of the Wonders of Theta shop in Denrim, the Cookie Dwarf merchant Garen in Orzmar, who enchants most of his wares himself and has gone a tiny bit crazy from working with Lyrium for so long. But I digress. Again. As you're looting the Darkspawn you've just killed to save Bodan, you may also find the corpse of a mage. Looting the corpse results in you finding a sealed letter, which unlocks the Maleficarum Regrets Codex entry. Reading the entry reveals a letter that an apostate blood mage named Bell wrote to Melis, likely the dead mage we just found. He doesn't want to return to the Circle Tower and would much rather live his life continuously being hunted by the Templars. But he wants for Melis to try to find a life in the Circle. He left a cache of supplies stolen from the enchanters during his time in the Circle, hidden in an alcove in the study area. I'm not sure how to interpret this codex entry. Is the dead mage Melis? And if so, has she escaped the Circle Tower? Or was she trying to travel to the Circle to gain admission and become an apprentice? I would really love to know what the original writer's intent was when creating this little codex entry, because it's been puzzling me for years. I am leaning towards believing that Melis was a fellow apostate who was trying to make her way to the Circle based on Bell's letter, which urged her to do so. The reason I think so is because Bell's cache is actually a little treasure trove you can find in the Circle Tower if you obtained this codex entry. You can find it in the senior mage quarters of the tower during the main quest Broken Circle. So I guess Melis never made it to the tower. Was she killed by the Darkspawn we just fought? Or did she die earlier on at the hands of one of the bandit groups around Lothering? Regardless, with this sad note, my extremely long guided tour of Lothering comes to an end. And now, with having laid out everything that Lothering does for the player, I can finally answer the question, why is Lothering so weird? Why does it feel like a starter town while the player encounters it after multiple hours of playtime? The thing is, even though the player has been playing the game for multiple hours now and understands decently well how combat works, how gear and consumables work, what to expect in conversations with NPCs and so on, they don't actually know enough about the story to be able to be simply thrust into it at full speed. The events at Ostagar dramatically shifted the direction of the story, as well as the player character's role in it. Suddenly, you're not the most junior warden on the team, being given the easiest task together with Alistair so that you're kept out of the main battle. No, now you're the leader of the 2 remaining Grey Wardens because Alistair doesn't want the responsibility, and also you're the protagonist. Suddenly, you need to figure out how to raise an army by gaining the support of various factions strewn around the entire kingdom. So Lothering exists as an in-between point, an insignificant location where you can come to grips with the monumental task before you, and also decide which one of these tasks to tackle first. And unfortunately, there is kind of a right and wrong answer. Mostly just wrong answers. Tackling the Elven and Dwarven quests first is extremely difficult, as the levels of the enemies in those areas are much higher than the level that your party is currently at. Redcliffe Village and the Circle of Magi are where you're supposed to go first, Redcliffe especially. You have Alistair telling you about Arl Eamon all the way back at Flemeth's hut, and then reminding you that he thinks going to Redcliffe first is best when you have the discussion with him and Morrigan upon reaching Lothering. And then again, you are pushed towards going to Redcliffe if you speak to Sir Donal in the Chantry and find out that Arl Eamon fell mysteriously ill and no cure has worked so far, magical or not, and all his knights are searching for the mythical sacred ashes of Andraste to have any hope of saving his life. Of course, you are actually free to go anywhere you want. I often go to Denrim for a little bit to pick up and do a few side quests, make a little money, get a few pieces of gear from the shops and so on. But I do think that if Lothering didn't exist and the player was simply told to choose one of many locations to travel to, right after being pushed by Flemeth to pursue these warden treaties to gain aid against the Darkspawn, the player would feel overwhelmed. So Lothering is there to provide just a little more of a scripted progression. Here's how you travel on the world map to this one location that's available outside of your camp. Here's what you have to do in case you forgot, and here's where your companions would choose to go. And here, have a low-stakes environment where you can test out various things like persuading or intimidating NPCs, using your skills or your companion's skills in dialogue to open up possibilities for quests, like the herbalism, trap-making, and poison-making quests, with these side quests also offering opportunities for tutorializing the crafting systems if the player hasn't used a crafting skill yet. And here's how you may come across recruitable companions. You have the choice of whether you want to let them join your party or not. And truth be told, this last bit of information is important to convey to the player because until now you haven't really had a choice on whether you wanted to allow someone into your party or not. Alistair and Morrigan join automatically, though if you go to the party camp you are able to tell Morrigan to leave if you wish to. But this is why Lothering still very much feels like a starter town in an RPG, because until now your character didn't really hold the reins, and now that they do, it can feel intimidating or even overwhelming to immediately have to choose what to do. So the game makes the choice for you, tells you from the beginning that this choice of going to Lothering is insignificant. Lothering is just a pit stop, a place where you can resupply if you want to, maybe make some money by doing some tasks, listen to some news to figure out where you want to go next. Of course, Lothering isn't just a place that psychologically prepares the player for the more non-linear main questline that is to follow. It is a very meaningful place for low-level characters, and especially less experienced players, to obtain some much-needed XP, money, some early gear upgrades, and even extra companions to be able to experiment with and see what kind of party composition they enjoy playing with. Lothering is also the first place where you're actually free to interact with as much or as little of it as you want. Lothering and the Imperial Highway is considered a main quest, but the only thing you're required to do to complete this quest is travel to the exit of Lothering. which involves a few scripted encounters, the Highwayman, the conversation about your next steps, and the fight against the Darkspawn to save Bodan at the exit. But other than those scripted encounters, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to recruit either companion, you don't have to enter the Chantry or the Tavern, you don't have to kill any enemies other than the Darkspawn. You can talk your way past the Highwaymen and then run on the edge of town and likely also not have to deal with a group of bandits near the highway. Not sure about that one. Possibly you could have to fight those unless you can sneak past them. Until Lothering, your origin story was a fairly linear experience with not much freedom in exploration and conversations. Similarly, Ostagar, while being a bit more open and allowing you to do some side quests and things, was also quite a linear experience. You meet the recruits and Alistair at camp, you go to the Korkari Wilds to get some Darkspawn blood and find the ancient treaties, you meet Morrigan and Flemeth, then go through the joining and are sent to light the beacon at the Tower of Ishal with Alistair. The tower is overrun by Darkspawn, so you have to fight your way through it. You light the beacon, but Loghain retreats anyway, and as you are swarmed by Darkspawn, Flemeth swoops in to save you. In comparison to all this epic, yet linear adventure, Lothering is just kind of on the way. Hopefully, as I've shown, Lothering has a lot more to offer than just some supplies or companions. There's a lot of role-playing opportunities to start feeling your way through how you want to approach this story with your character. And of course, you also get a little nudge, a few little nudges towards Redcliffe, which is a good area to travel to early, especially for less experienced players who may not be able to survive the more difficult encounters during the other main quests. A really important thing that Lothering does is that it does very much act like the starter town of these other types of RPGs which have a much shorter prologue than Origins. But due to the different experience that each player can have in the beginning of the game based on their chosen origin, they could be missing some information about how to interact with the game's systems. What if you didn't interact with any merchant until Lothering? You didn't have one in your origin story and didn't talk to the quartermaster at Ostagar because you didn't realize he could also sell you gear, not just provide gear for the king's army. What if you only followed the main tasks that Duncan gave you, didn't stray off the beaten path, didn't talk to the prisoner with the key to the mage's chest, didn't discover the hidden cache in the Korkari Wilds? You need this starter town for the player to feel free to experiment a little bit with what they do and finally get to experience what it's like to be in the full game and the freedom and consequences that come along with it. A lot of the choices you make in Lothering don't really affect much at all. Maybe you gain or lose a little money, maybe you successfully persuade people against fighting you, or you have to fight them. Other than Liliana and Sten, no one else in Lothering is important. No one else is mentioned in the epilogue slides based on the choices you made, but the plethora of choices offered to you in this shitty little village do change the way that you experience the story. They let you feel more immersed in the world of the game without making you feel like you have to rush through. Even if NPCs keep telling you that there isn't much to this village, just look at how long my guided tour of Lothering took. There's actually so much content in here to talk about, and I could have described it in even more detail than this. And on the other hand, while some NPCs tell you that you'd better leave town quickly before the Darkspawn arrive, your own companions keep reminding you that if you leave, you may not be able to return once it's overrun by the Horde. So are you really sure you want to go? Are you really sure you're done exploring this place, talking to people, doing quests? So your own companions are encouraging you to explore, take your time, immerse yourself. I think this insignificance of Lothering is actually one of its greatest strengths. If the writer knows that Lothering is going to be reduced to rubble, they can add as much personality to this location's NPCs as they want. They can add as many choices for the player in conversations and quests as they want, because these choices ultimately are there for flavor, for changing the way the story feels like to the player. You don't get to see any of these Lothering NPCs later on in Denrim if you convince them to have hope when speaking to the Doomsayer. You don't hear anything about Elder Miriam or Sir Bryant or any of the other characters you interacted with. Whereas in other areas of importance, the writers have to be careful with what they add because the player will likely be expecting some amount of meaningful consequences and NPC reactivity. In Lothering, it doesn't matter. And because it doesn't matter, it ends up being a lot better. I like to talk a lot about the origin stories themselves being this huge driver of player motivation at the beginning of the game that immerses you into the world and story of Dragon Age, and I do think that's true to some extent. But Lothering really exposes you to what it's like to play the rest of the game, which is not nearly as linear and especially curated or limited of an experience as the origin stories in the Ostagar prologue are. So yes, that's Lothering, a weird starter town that's really just a middle or in-between town. A little ramp to help you prepare to tackle the many different main and side quests that are suddenly available to you in this epic RPG. Even though I have an understanding of why Lothering is the way it is, I still think it's weird, because I can't really point to any other game that I've played and say, yeah, look, this is their version of Lothering. I can point to games like the Elder Scrolls and say, this is the starter town. This is the place where you learn about interacting with people, stealing their belongings, or sleeping in their beds, crafting items, buying from and selling to merchants, and so on. I think that Lothering would feel much more like a starting town if Dragon Age Origins removed the origin stories and instead started with your character as, let's say, a prisoner who was caught sneaking around camp in Ostagar. Essentially a customizable version of the prisoner who stole the mage's key. So you were caught and imprisoned by the soldiers, and then let's say you witnessed a failed joining ritual of Davith and Jory. Duncan needs a Grey Warden, so he forces you to drink the Darkspawn blood and you survive. So then you'd only really get to play through the Tower of Vishal portion of the game, which feels kind of like the dungeon or combat heavy kind of sequence that you go through in Oblivion and Skyrim. So then after being saved by Flemeth, suddenly you're playing the game and there's so much more than just killing Darkspawn and looting stuff. And the thing is that even with this new version of Dragon Age, Lothering would still work well, because it does very much have the content of a starter town. You'd just need the tutorial pop-ups and stuff and it would absolutely work. But of course, interesting thought experiment as this is, thankfully Dragon Age Origins has a set of much more interesting starting points for your character. And so instead of teaching you something new, Lothering just lets you take a moment to process everything that's just happened. Your new role as a leader, and all the new huge quests that have been added to your journal. And it tells you, are you sure you're ready to move on? Take your time. Lothering won't be here forever, so enjoy it while you can. I hope you enjoyed this extremely long and rambling video in which I dissect a relatively small section of my favorite game into tiny little pieces and talk about what I think it all means. I always love thinking and talking about Dragon Age Origins since it's my all-time favorite game, but to be honest, I never would have thought to take the time to analyze Lothering in so much depth if it weren't for some videos that I saw about starter towns in the Elder Scrolls series created by Takarias. So if you enjoyed this kind of video, I highly recommend that you check out his videos about Seyda-Neen in Morrowind and Riverwood in Skyrim. Really great analysis, same kind of rambly discussion videos, very chill voice that's nice to listen to, and tons of interesting thoughts about how these things feel like to the player. If you have any ideas for quests or places for me to analyze from the Dragon Age trilogy or some other RPGs like the Elder Scrolls series, Fable, that kind of stuff, do let me know. It took me a super long time to write all my thoughts down, but it was a ton of fun to do it, and I can't wait to do it again. If you're looking forward to more videos about Dragon Age and other games I like, do remember to subscribe, and leave a like and comment while you're at it too. They really help. A special thank you to my members, who help keep this channel running. I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider joining the channel as a member to support me and unlock perks like early access to videos. This has been B Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.